Go around. Let's get started. Let me remind you that my goal is to get in some quick steps, key points from the implementation and the attempted extension of Medicare in the 60s to the Affordable Care Act in 2010 and a little beyond, maybe 2012 or so. We already talked about what happened in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. And I had just begun to discuss what I think is a key turning point in 1983, which is when, given the political necessities that he faced, President Reagan tried to get some sort of control over the inflating Medicare budget, not by harming beneficiaries directly, but rather by trying to reduce payments to providers and switching, as in retrospect should have been the case from the beginning. There are a couple of handouts that have gone around. Are there any extra copies for those folks?
Got one of this one.
Okay, if you're missing something when we get to it, please let me know. We'll look on with someone next to you. I don't want to interrupt. I want to try to get some momentum today. I want to cover. Anyway, the notion was to change payment from what in retrospect looks like a insane, wildly inflationary cost-plus retrospective reimbursement scheme for Medicare to a prospective, DRG-based, diagnosis-related group, that is fee schedule-based kind of measures that would be able to curb some of the Medicare costs by putting the onus and the burden and the responsibility on the providers without cutting benefits per se. That meant that the incentives would dramatically transform from trying to inflate the Medicare budget, knowing that it would be reimbursed. Instead, given prospective payment for the future, this is a set amount for this diagnosis, then the provider and the provider institutions would do a number of things. They, of course, try to find the most complex, most reimbursable diagnostic category to fit the various complex symptom pictures in, and people played the game, and they got very good at it, of finding the right combination of symptoms to get more reimbursement, but it was according to a fee schedule. The main thing they had to do, if this is the set amount, was to try to save money by cutting down hospital stays drastically, moving from a week at a hospital, 2 weeks at a hospital, to a day or two or overnight, because if they were able to accomplish the care they were supposed to provide for the patient with that given amount of money, then the provider institution was allowed to keep the difference. So the incentive was absolutely reversed. Economize, try to do things quickly, and that in many cases made sense because a lot of the hospital stays in the past were essentially hotel stays. They didn't really add anything to the care, maybe a little more security, the patient was stable and so on. But if you did cost effectiveness analyses, they didn't show that there was much real value added. And this was perhaps the time to change and maybe make some innovations under these new incentives. On the other hand, people worried that there would be too quick hospitalizations. Patients who needed more stay in the hospital, more care, would be whisked through the doors and out again so that bed could be filled with someone else. The hospital got reimbursed every time a bed was filled with a diagnosis attached, not to have someone linger in bed and accrue reimbursable expenses retrospectively. All this is, at least in schematic form, discussed and pretty clearly presented by Shi and Singh, particularly on pages 229, 259, and 299 to 300. Read those carefully to get the sense of the very fundamental change in incentives with prospective payment. So when Medicare went to prospective payment, PPS, via DRGs, diagnostic-related groups, more alphabet soup to add to your diet. This actually led to a cascade of additional effects that swept through the entire healthcare system. The reason for this is obvious. Medicare at that point was 40% of the hospital budget, which is an enormous percentage, and so if something changed for a 40% portion of the budget, a lot of things would have to change. One thing that changed is that commercial insurers, who provided most of the rest of the care, not all of the 60%, but most of the rest of it, now realized that the hospitals would be doing certain clear, predictable things, and they wanted to get ahead of that. They knew that hospitals would try to shift costs to the patients who were being reimbursed by the commercial insurers. And so they would start charging higher rates, higher fees for the commercially insured patients to make up for the difference. There'd be this sort of cost transfer. To anticipate that, the commercial insurers, the Aetnas and Prudentials and so on, actually played both sides of the street, trying to optimize their financial circumstances. Whenever possible, and in some communities it was possible, here in Rochester it was possible, there were various experiments of this kind, the various commercial insurers tried to adopt PPS, DRG-like procedures of their own. They tried to move to prospective payment, get the whole system, Medicare-supported and non-Medicare-supported patients, all on one common system with pooled resources. And there was an experiment in Rochester that got a lot of national attention, trying to move in that direction. Didn't work in all systems, and even when it did work, didn't stop the commercial insurers from trying to maximize profits in other ways. Now they simply charge higher rates. They charge for the patients who were normally going to be covered by their insurance, still higher rates for those who had to buy those policies because they knew the hospitals would be charging them higher rates. And they wanted to keep ahead of that and continue to make the same or even increased profits. When insurers started charging higher rates, that put a lot of pressure on employers, since most of that insurance was bought by employers for employees with cost sharing. And what they did, employers across the 80s made deductibles and co-pays deeper and steeper, and so that the burden on the employers who were providing part of the premium would be lessened. So all these cascade of events come from this major decision by the federal government to move to prospective payment. Another very important thing happened in addition to deeper co-pays and deductibles that was passed on to the employees from the employers, although the employers were still struggling with the additional costs. Managed care is what became very attractive. Managed care, HMOs, and there's a very good general overview of managed care in Shi and Singh, pages 337 to 343, which you should read carefully, especially pages 337 and 343. These are endpoints of that discussion. Find out what it was about, a little bit of its history. Managed care was experimented with but didn't get very far in the 70s. It was something that Nixon pushed. There were various attempts by commercial insurers to move in the managed care direction. But the really big takeoff was in the 80s and into the 90s because it made sense in cost-effective terms for employers. If their employees were covered through a managed care plan, the essence of which is that the insurance function and the administration of the plan and the provision of care is merged into one organization, one entity, a managed care organization. So you no longer have really the third party payer. The first party is the patient, the second party is the provider, the third party is the intermediary. In this case, the third party really becomes part of the second party, and the physicians and hospitals that provide care are part of networks that grow very significantly with very important commercial for-profit oversight and organization. As patients get pushed, as employers see the advantages of these managed care plans, they realize that they can save lots of money. Managed care plans cost a lot less than the old reimbursement plans. And it was therefore in their interest of the employers to buy managed care plans. Commercial insurers developed managed care plans. Some developed outside of the commercial insurance network. There were a lot to choose from. Managed care plans competed by saying, we can deliver the same care that you intend to deliver to your employees, that you may be under pressure to deliver to your employees, for a cheaper price. And so that was an incentive that was hard to miss. And managed care plans developed very, very rapidly. Their enrollments increased very dramatically across the 80s and into the 90s. This meant that there were other changes that were underway. Health reform which had previously been an issue that was of greatest sort of emotional and political appeal to those who advocated for the uninsured, the poor people not covered. Now health reform became an issue for everyone, including especially middle-class patients, employees of large corporations that provided their care through managed care arrangements. Because they were hurting, middle-class patients, relatively well-paid employees of major corporations, now had to pay deeper and deeper co-pays and deductibles and the like, and their choice of providers and their choice of provider institutions was restricted because they were part of managed care networks. And they didn't like the fact that they would lose their old relationship with their long-standing general internist or obstetrician or whatever. And now they were forced to use people in the plan who may have been quite different from those who they had gone to before. So middle-class people objected. They and their providers often got angry when a particular procedure that the provider recommended was not allowed by the managed care organization overseer. There were all sorts of managers who said, no, that's not allowed. No, no, you need a second opinion for that. No, no, you can do it this other way. No, no, you should go to this other institution. There was a tremendous oversight and intrusion which deeply, deeply angered providers and deeply, deeply disturbed patients. And so everyone, middle-class people, poor people, advocates for both, were getting increasingly concerned with the need for health reform, in large part by the latter 80s because of changes that came from managed care, which in turn grew in popularity because of changes in the reimbursement of Medicare. All this follows as a cascade of events. If you look at this handout on page 2, upper left, you will see a cartoon by Herb Locke, a brilliant political cartoonist who had a very long career. He won the Pulitzer Prize for political cartooning 3 different times. And you've seen 3 of his cartoons now. Go back and look at some of the handouts in the 30s, in the 60s, and now in the early 90s. There you have Herb Locke capturing the sense not only is the patient without coverage shivering in his bed because there is no coverage, but the patient who is covered with too much complexity and burden, and he isn't a happy camper either. That's what it means to say that health reform had become a middle-class issue and not just an issue for the poor and their advocates. This was that moment when political attention shifted to the needs of the middle class, of well-insured workers who were covered by unions working in Detroit, for example. During Jesse Jackson's run at the Democratic nomination in 1988. Democrats had dropped health reform from the early 80s, from Reagan's election. They didn't even put it in their platform in 1984. Didn't think it was possible. First time the Democrats had stepped away from national health reform since the 40s, or in a way even since the 30s. But now Jesse Jackson brought it back. He was a great appeal to organized labor. He was a great appeal to union members, especially in manufacturing states like Michigan. He scared the Democratic establishment by winning the Michigan primary over the leading candidates that were really the favorites of the Democratic establishment. And so he came into the 1988 convention riding on a very strong wave of health reform. And there on page 1 of the handout, bottom right, you can see a photo of Jesse Jackson getting off or on a campaign bus as part of that campaign. It made a very significant difference. What the Democrats did is to try to sort of mute or blunt some of the thrust of Jesse Jackson's campaign. Jesse Jackson supported a single-payer initiative. His advisors, key health advisors, were people who at the same time were forming the very important national advocacy group PNHP, Physicians for a National Health Program, Two of his key advisors were Steffi Woolhandler and David Himmelstein, who emerged as the intellectual center of the PNHP movement, which has grown from a few hundred physicians in the late 80s to well over 25,000 and a very strong medical student contingent now with local chapters right here, in which Alina is centrally involved, and so on. This has become a major thing. The people who came up with that idea were Jesse Jackson's principal health advisors. The Democrats were afraid of that, or at least the Democratic leadership. And so they wanted to find someone who could support health reform and aim at the middle class, but not be too threatening. And the person they found was a man called Michael Dukakis, who at the time was governor, Democratic governor, so middle of the road, a Democrat governor of Massachusetts, which in the late 80s had gone through a version of health reform. It was what in retrospect was called the first Massachusetts plan. The second Massachusetts plan was designed and implemented in the 2000s when Mitt Romney was governor, Republican, was governor of Massachusetts. And we'll get to that in a bit. It's very important in the background for the Affordable Care Act and its politics. Dukakis got the nomination. He made health reform part of his campaign, though he took a more moderate stand than Jesse Jackson had wanted. But Jesse Jackson and his supporters pushed to get on the platform, and they succeeded. And the next major event, the Democrats now are re-identified with national health reform, though in a somewhat ambiguous and amorphous way. They're identified with it. Another major event happened in Pennsylvania in the early 90s. The sitting senator, one of the sitting senators from Pennsylvania, was a Republican named Heinz. The same Heinz whose family brings you ketchup in 57 varieties, that Heinz, okay? And so he was a wealthy man, he had support, but if I remember correctly, he died in a small plane crash, and his seat was now vacant. There was a decision to have a by-election, not a governor appointee, but a by-election, and both a Democrat and a Republican vied for that seat. The Republican who was put up as the candidate to get that senatorial seat was a man called Richard Thornborough, who was very, very well known. He was a former governor of Pennsylvania, so he had very, very high name recognition and visibility, and he had been an attorney general under the first Bush president, George H.W. Bush. Whereas the Democratic candidate was a relative unknown, a man named Harris Wofford. He had done some interesting things, but he was a political newcomer. He focused his campaign. He had a sense of the pulse of the people in Pennsylvania. He had good political instincts and intuition. And so Wofford focused his campaign on health reform aimed primarily at the middle class, those people burdened, as in Herb Locke's cartoon, in the bed on the left. When the campaign began, in the early stages, he was way, way, way behind Thornborough in the polls. Thornborough had name recognition, he had track record, he had been governor, and so on, and here was Wofford as this unknown coming into that contest. But Wofford kept hammering at the health reform issue, how it's hurting middle-class people, how something must be done, how we must make this an issue for Pennsylvania and bring it to the national stage. And remarkably, Wofford won this senatorial by-election. And that sent shockwaves through the political system. The people who wound up as Clinton's principal political advisors. Clinton was already getting ready in Arkansas to make a bid for the presidency. He was an up-and-coming, very bright, very effective, very attractive young political candidate. He needed top advisors to help him shape the issues. One of these key advisors was the famous James Carville, famous political strategist, a raging Cajun from down there in New Orleans. And he was in Pennsylvania, watching what was happening, and then decided, Wofford is our signal. We're going to have to make national health reform one of Clinton's major planks in the platform when he runs for the nomination, and then if he gets the nomination, when he runs for president. So that, in short, is what happened. It showed the Clinton people a key plank that he had to promote, and it did become, in fact, a major issue in his campaign, and we all know that in 1992, Clinton won. So he comes into office as president with a very, very strong commitment to health reform, knowing that this is something of concern not only to the middle class, but poor, all sorts of people. What plan he came up with, though, moved from being a fuzzy, foggy kind of thing in the early days of the campaign to something which took on increasing shape and borrowed from ideas that were current in the health policy community, where there were key folks like a man called Elaine Enthoven, an economist at Stanford, were promoting a managed competition plan. I'm not even sure that Clinton understood well what managed competition meant. Certainly didn't understand it with all the subtlety and depth that Enthoven intended. But if you actually track Clinton's speeches and other public statements during his campaign, as you move through the summer and into the fall of 1992, he wins in November 1992, he more and more consistently supports a managed competition program. He thinks of it, and his advisors think of it, as the perfect compromise. Because if you look at the managed part of it, that sounds like government oversight, government regulation. And that's something that more liberal or progressive Democrats would support, and more progressive policy people. We need to have government oversight and regulation for a rational health system. On the other hand, the other part of that phrase, competition, suggests strong market competition, and surely Republicans, more conservative Democrats would support that. So why not? Perfect compromise, managed competition in which you have the best of both. It turns out that only policy wonks like Enthoven and other people who followed him and others who modified it and tweaked it a bit were the only ones who really were fond of the managed competition idea. Many other people, including those long committed to health reform of what had now become called the single payer variety, Medicare for all, in which the government plays the role as for Medicare of collecting premiums and distributing reimbursement and so on. They preferred a plan like that, not managed competition, which would provide regulatory oversight for big chains of competing health systems, which is what the managed competition plan, that is, you allow a lot of the market in, but you try to curb some of its excesses. There were Democrats who didn't understand that, didn't like it, thought that that was too much of a concession to industry, and they really wanted to hold out. There was a strong base of support already by the early 90s for single payer, people who understood what Jesse Jackson was getting at. Their numbers grew. PNHP was very effective in recruiting supporters, and this is where things began really to take an interesting shape. By early 1993, Clinton is inaugurated in January. Soon after that, he appoints a healthcare commission of outstanding policy people and all kinds of other advisors. They are supposed to be selected from across the political spectrum with a variety of views, but they, of course, tend to be, since Clinton is already biased towards managed competition, they tend to be biased themselves overall towards managed competition, though there are a couple of members of the commission who were single-payer supporters and so on. And he makes the famous decision that he will appoint the First Lady, Hillary Rodham Clinton, as the face of the commission. She didn't actually chair the commission, but she sat in with it. She followed all the deliberations. She was very, very smart. She was a quick study. She picked up all these complex ideas and issues, and she was the one who would testify before Congress, who would go on TV, would be the public face of that commission. And so in the spring and summer, supposedly in secret, Clinton's commission designed the plan, which got more and more complex, more and more robust and inclusive, wound up resulting in legislation that ran for well over 2,000 pages of legal text and so on. And all during that time, while this was supposedly happening behind closed doors, Hillary is the face of the commission and defending the attempt at crafting a new health plan that the president will introduce. Parts of that report leaked, and because of leaks, the Clinton folks rushed at the end and may have botched the job. So in August and early September, they're trying to finish things up. They may not have been ready. All the details weren't worked out, but they felt, because of the pressure of the leaks, that they had to come out with something. In late September, I think it was September 22nd, I don't remember the exact date, but it was about 21st or 22nd, Clinton makes a televised national speech. He addresses both houses of Congress and all the other dignitaries in Washington. It's televised on all the major networks and outlets. And he holds up a card, which he says, this is your health security card. And with this card, you will gain access to the healthcare system, etc. And the campaign is off, but not running, rather limping. As Reed points out, as almost anyone who looks at what Clinton did, as she and Singh point out, the Clintons, his advisors, the commission, made some very significant mistakes. One major mistake is that they allowed the commission of health policy experts, health policy wonks if you like, to design the plan, both the general features and its specifics. And most of these were based on unfamiliar concepts to politicians. The general public may have been known in the world of Eindhoven and high-level health policy folks, but made very little sense, were hard to grasp hold of by the general public. Because the commission was designing the program by choice, the Clintons left Congress out. He was forced to, in a way, because one of the strong themes of his campaign is that he ran against the Washington establishment. He was an outsider, governor of Arkansas. He was not part of the in crowd in Washington. Therefore, he'd be a fresh voice, a new broom, sweep clean, and so on. So even if he had wanted to, he couldn't have involved too many of the old political hands in Washington, because that would have contradicted a major thrust of his campaign. Well, that means, while a secret commission is proceeding, the key health reform leaders in Congress who have staked out that area for decades in some cases are royally annoyed. The technical term, I guess, would be politically pissed off. They were excluded, and they didn't like this secret deal. So instead of having people who would be his prospective supporters and allies in Congress on his side, they were often opposed, just because they felt overlooked, left out, ignored, and so on. The commission, especially Hillary, with some occasionally loose remarks, antagonized the insurance industry. Yes, the insurance industry was certainly culpable of all sorts of evil doings, or at least intended evil doings. But there were politic ways of saying that and impolitic ways of saying that. Hillary chose impolitic ways of saying that, and the health insurance industry began a massive publicity campaign based on a series of ads called the Harry and Louise ads, and those are the two characters that feature in them, that go after Hillary and the Democratic reform effort. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which had grown pretty strong in support of single payer by the early 90s, was left out, ignored, given maybe a couple of hours of airtime in the committee. And so they become antagonized. Traditional leaders in Congress are antagonized. They're not in support of it. Progressive leaders in support of health reform are antagonized because their option isn't what's going to be focused on. The insurance industry is antagonized. And then you have all the traditional strong opponents to health reform, from big pharma, et cetera, that are all lined up against health reform to begin with. And then there is another major defection. The Clinton administration was counting on the strong support of organized labor. But what happens as the plan in Clinton makes his public announcement of what's really in it, the managed competition idea, many in labor become opposed. They don't like it. They'd rather support single payer. So labor becomes divided. And without a unified labor force in the background, it is very hard to imagine health reform progressing forward to legislative enactment. It's something like what happened during the Truman administration under the pressure of the Cold War in the late 40s and 50s. Labor fractures and divides, with much of labor in the late 40s going for the moderate plan, which was to encourage commercial insurance as a way of covering laborers, employees. Others holding out for a single payer type plan, which had been the original proposal in the Wagner-Murray-Dingle bills. A similar thing happens now. Labor is fractured. So you can get a good sense of this going on, just the way the Clinton reform effort goes off the rails by looking at Reed 163 to 164 and 183 to 184. You can also look at some of these political cartoons, and the most notable of which is on page 2, upper right. And there's with a nod to Escher, M.C. Escher, whose famous woodcut, that's not a woodcut, it's a tin plate, but anyway, it's a print, it's a brilliant print, which is called, I believe, Relativity, the original. This is a modification of it in which we see Hillary trying to navigate, following her map, the terrain of healthcare reform. And if you look closely, it's really surreal. None of the stairs lead anywhere. The planes are all askew. The horizon and the vertical planes are confused. And so this is a bizarre world of incoherence, and Hillary is trying to navigate her way around it and gets trapped. She can't find her way out. Here's another very important dimension of this story. People who became key to President Obama's health reform efforts in 2009, 2010, were eyewitnesses to the Clintons' blunders and failures in the early 90s. They were eyewitnesses, and they decided to never make those mistakes again if they had another opportunity to push for health reform. They would learn from this debacle, and they would guide whoever they may be able to guide sometime in the future to a different and better way to proceed. Two of these key people who are eyewitnesses were two brothers, Ezekiel and Rahm Emanuel. I'm sure I got the spelling right. I guess it's one M and one E. Ezekiel was a physician, trained at Harvard, very respected, who came to the Clinton White House as a special health care advisor and as a sort of presidential intern, and then went back to Harvard. He had tremendous reputation. He is now a distinguished professor at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, still writing about health reform. He was President Obama's chief medical advisor during the shaping of the Affordable Care Act. And his younger brother, Rahm, was around to see what was happening. He wasn't a medical person. He wasn't a health policy person per se. He was a rough and tumble political operative who loved the sort of the hand-to-hand combat in rough politics. By no accident, Rahm Emanuel is now the mayor of Chicago, where that kind of politics is tradition. In the years of the Obama push for the Affordable Care Act, Rahm Emanuel played a key role in the politics of that because he was Barack Obama's chief of staff. Rahm Emanuel was based in Chicago. Barack Obama was based in Chicago. Barack Obama made his reputation in Chicago politics and then in the Illinois State Senate. They knew each other. And I guess Obama knew that he needed a very tough guy to try to run the very strict political activities in support of his health reform. They learned, these Emanuel brothers, by watching the failures of the Clinton efforts, to be sure to deal Congress in, and to be sure to try to produce a unified approach in the Democratic Party. Don't let them fracture and fragment. And when Rahm Emanuel became Barack Obama's chief of staff, 20 or so years later, roughly, he played that game with brute Chicago-style force. People often refer to him as if he had brass knuckles and would be beating people up in dark alleys, not quite literally, but in effect. He was very, very tough on people. If they strayed away from the line that the Obama administration was trying, Barack Obama was very genteel, professorial, etc., etc. But then under the shadow, there was Rahm Emanuel pounding people in the ribs. You better cooperate or you're out. You're taking your... And that was a lesson that they learned from the failures of Clinton to do that and to allow the fragmentation of the Democratic Party to be a major, major problem. That also wound up giving very conservative Democrats a very strong hand. Those conservative Democrats were generally called, in the political language of the time, the Blue Dog Democrats. Blue Dog Democrats meant that they were essentially, they behaved more like Republicans than like Democrats. Many of the policies they supported were more Republican than Democratic, but they were key members of the Democratic caucus, and getting their assent was an essential part of it. So that became Rahm Emanuel's job, to try to keep the party reined in, and Ezekiel Emanuel, as the health policy advisor, was trying to tell Obama, don't come in with new invented phrases, managed competition. People are not going to understand that. By the early 90s, there was a lot of antagonism nationally to managed care, and folks out there in the general political sort of arena could not distinguish between managed care and managed competition. It all meant the same thing to them, and if they hated managed care, they probably would hate managed competition even more. So Ezekiel Emanuel's result: tweak things, reform things, keep as much of the system intact, fill in holes, fill in gaps. That was the kind of lesson that Ezekiel Emanuel learned, and that they made sure that Obama followed. Before we get to that, to some of the nitty-gritty of the implementation of or the political fight for the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, we need to go back a little bit and fill in some of the gap between 1994 and 2009, when the big push for the Affordable Care Act began. We have this continuity, this bridge, but there was a lot that happened in those 15 or so years in between. And let me just try to hit some high points. One thing that happened is that the Republicans in the early 90s, back in the early 90s now, led by Newt Gingrich, deliberately demonized the health reform efforts of Clinton. They called it a dramatic socialization of society and so on, and led a powerful backlash against those reform efforts, which had built some support, but then began to fall apart in the confusion and in all the differences and problems that the Clinton administration had created for itself or allowed to continue to develop. So the Republicans said everything about Clinton's intended reform is wrong. In fact, everything that Clinton intended is wrong, and led a very powerful boomerang effect. So the Republicans came in and gained a majority in Congress in 1994, not very long into the Clintons' presidency. The actual Clinton health reform measure, for all the hoopla and all the effort and energy that went into it, was never even introduced for a vote in Congress. It went so belly up, it disappeared. But the political after effects were powerful, because Gingrich and other conservative Republicans were saying, let's see, that's what happens when you let Democrats take the leadership. And so the Republicans gained power and authority in '94. But Gingrich wasn't a very disciplined politician. He began to say things that frightened and antagonized a lot of people. The Democrats were successful in demonizing Gingrich, who had been demonizing Clinton. And by 1996, Democrats realized that Gingrich had overplayed his hand, and he became the villain of the piece. And so the Democrats were able to regain many of the seats they had lost. And Clinton, of course, won a second term as president in 1996, which looked very, very unlikely in '94 and '95. This is because of the errors made under Gingrich's leadership. Clinton wins a second term, and he has learned one important lesson. Don't go for global health reform. If you want to achieve things in the health arena, then do it in a more piecemeal manner. And so he does. And he supports two very important reform measures that already had state precedents in many cases. He now makes them federal, that are a very significant legacy from the second term of Clinton. There were health reforms of great significance, but they were not the global universal reform attempt in the first term. They were rather, in 1996 and 1997, two major pieces of legislation. S-CHIP, Program for Children's Health Reform, that actually won and still has, to a significant degree, bipartisan support. And it is now a problematic issue right now in the Trump administration. But it passed in '96, and even though Bush did not support it, vetoed it, even with combined bipartisan Democratic and Republican support during his term, as soon as Obama came in, S-CHIP was renewed and amplified, and is an important part of Obama's reform. So S-CHIP came in, and another major achievement was HIPAA. HIPAA was meant to be a broader reform, not just for privacy. The HIPAA stands for Portability and Privacy, the Health Insurance Portability and Privacy and Portability Act. We remember it mostly as the privacy thing, the very strict HIPAA restrictions on what data can be accessed by whom and so on, very, very tight, very different now. But it also had a very important feature of portability, that it made much more flexible ways of carrying over insurance if people were moving from one job to the other or were in a period of unemployment. It was trying to soften some of that blow, and so it was a very important piecemeal measure, not a full universal measure, but certainly something of incremental importance. There were other attempts to rein in some of the extremes and excesses of the managed care organizations. This had begun at the state level. Various states passed their measures, and again, under Clinton, these became federal measures. So these were of great importance. If you actually draw a graph of the uninsured in the United States, starting back in the 1980s, the number of the uninsured grow and grow and grow and grow, and then in the late 1990s, early 2000s, they actually dip. So the growth of the uninsured decreases in large part because of these kinds of measures. But then in the Bush administration and leading to Obama, the growth resumes after that little dip, which is probably related to these incremental measures. So what happens during the Bush administration? Bush generally ignores health reform, but he gets worried towards the end of his first term. 2003, as we know, he supports Medicare Part D, the MMA, Medicare Modernization Act, which includes Medicare Part D and other Medicare Advantage plans and other sorts of things. He does this in part because he knows that when Gore ran against him and actually won the presidency, which was given to him by the Supreme Court because of some funny doings in Florida, won the popular vote. He really probably won the Electoral College too. But in any case, Gore ran not only on what we all identify with Gore, very important environmental issues, but he also had a proposal for broadening Medicare, for allowing people to buy into Medicare within certain age groups, moving down from 65 to 55 and so on. He had a very robust drug coverage policy, and so when Bush comes up with the Medicare Modernization Act, which includes Medicare Part D to pay for pharmaceutical costs, he is in a way participating, if not another run by Gore, the run by a Democrat who might pick up and support Gore's health reform proposal. So Bush is trying to get ahead of the curve. So that's an important part of that. He also, as I've already said, vetoes an attempt to extend S-chip, which was carried over from the Clinton administration, and you get a sense of the politics of this and the political reaction on page 3 of that first handout. Top left on page 3, it's a cartoon you've already seen before. That's a commentary on the complexities of Part D and its giveaway to the pharmaceutical industry. And the one on the upper right is a commentary on how Bush pushes aside the needs of children for the S-chip program, but nonetheless seems to give a great bonanza to the prescription drug industry, and is of course supporting the Iraq War and other things, but kids are not taken care of, which is what the cartoon upper right on page 3 means. The Bush administration accepts all the ideology and language of those supporting commercial insurance, as in the lower left. No, of course you don't want a government program. No, that will create a horrible bureaucracy. You'll be moving towards socialism, even though the reality is, as that representative of a well-named company, Healthy Profits, Inc., you'll see behind him little Department of Claims Denials, Department of Relentless Advertising, Department of Pre-Existing Conditions, capturing some of the terrible things about commercial insurance. No, we don't want any of the government programs. Look at how wonderful our system is. And the cartoon on the bottom right captures a reality that 40 million people at that time, the number would grow to be over 50 million, were uninsured, priced out of the market, unable to pay for insurance, and then have no coverage whatsoever. And even those who are covered in this patchwork quilt arrangement, which they try to reform in little patches, missing the big picture, that they're covered and they're worrying about blue or green or polka dot patches, little fixes in the system, while the more major issue is right there in front of them, but they don't see it, or to their side. That is, so many people are left out. So I think we're going to have to stop here, and we're going to pick up the story in about 2004-05 and carry forward next time through the passage of the Affordable Care Act. So have a good Thanksgiving, rest, eat, sleep, and I'll see you on Monday.